one of them, John Edwards, Joe Biden, Chris Dodd, Dennis DeSantis, all of the candidates who stepped up and worked hard. Bill Richardson, I don't want to leave Bill out of it, in this campaign. But we now have to change our focus. Our focus is November. Our focus is stopping a Bush-Cheney third term. I spend a lot of time in the great city of Chicago. It gets cold in Chicago.
It's cold here.
Sometimes maybe even colder than Maine. But I know what happened. I don't want to get into that fight. But I know what happened here on February 10th. In town after town, Democrats and independents traveled over snowy roads and stood in long lines in freezing weathers to vote in your caucuses. And at the end of the day, Republicans had a turnout of 5,000, and we, the Democrats of Maine, had a turnout of 44,000 people. Now that tells me that Maine is ready for change. That you're ready to move this country forward beyond the Bush-Cheney legacy. 19 months ago, I sat down with my colleague Barack Obama. We talked about possibilities, and finally we were in the Union League Club in downtown Chicago. It was 5 o'clock on a Friday night. And I said to him, Barack, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm going home. And I said, we keep talking about getting together. We got to do it. So we went off to a side room, closed the door, and the two of us sat down. And I said to him, my friend, when it comes to politics, sometimes you pick the time, and sometimes the time will pick you. And I urged him to take up the challenge of running for President of the United States. I knew it was a long shot. Let's be honest, it was a long shot. He was new to the Senate, African-American, running for the highest office in the land. And he hadn't moved across this country. He'd been to many places, but not in a way to organize a campaign. And I said to him, if you'll run for this office, I'll stand behind you. In September, in February of 2007, on February the 10th, Barack Obama announced his candidacy for presidency in my hometown of Springfield. It was 12 degrees outside, a wind chill below zero, and 18,000 people stood in the cold to hear this announcement. I stood up and introduced him there as I had at the Boston Convention. I always introduce Barack. I don't know if you noticed this, but I introduced him, and I said to him, I'll stand by your side. I was the first United States Senator to endorse him, and for 11 months, I was the only United States Senator to endorse him. Shoulder for other senators to come along, and eventually they did. But for a long time, it was Durbin. Who's endorsed Obama? Durbin has endorsed Obama, you know? One of the reasons I did was alluded to earlier by Tom in his speech, and it has to do with a vote that I cast, and a vote that Tom cast as well. He cast hundreds of votes. If you ask me this week what we voted on last week, I have to stop and think long and hard. Most of them you don't remember, but there are votes you'll never forget. And the votes that you never forget are votes involving war. You know that if you cast that vote and the decision is made to go to war, that the enemy may die, but many of your friends and innocent people will die too. And so when the time came for that vote on the war in Iraq, many of you remember the environment in America. President, Vice President Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and Donald Rumsfeld had created this drumbeat mentality in this war, in this country, that we had to go to war, that there were weapons of mass destruction, that they had nuclear weapons and mushroom-shaped clouds that threatened Israel and our friends in the Middle East and threatened even the United States. They talked about Saddam Hussein and his linkage to 9/11. All of the threats that really brought America to the side of the president when that vote was cast. When that vote was cast in October of 2002, over 60% of the American people favored giving the president the authority to go to war. There were 23 of us in the Senate who voted no. 23 out of 100. And I want to tell you that the vote was cast just a few weeks before the election. And it was late at night. Tom can tell you, when it gets late at night in the House or the Senate, people like to vote and run. They want to go home and go to sleep. But I didn't want to leave the floor for some reason, and I stayed there. And I looked out on the floor of the United States Senate after that vote was cast, and I saw two other senators. One of them was Kent Conrad. Kent Conrad of North Dakota, a state that is so red that President Bush carried it by more than 25 points. But Kent Conrad had the courage to vote against that war. And I went up to Kent, and I thanked him, and I acknowledged that I knew he stuck his neck out. And there was one other senator that night that I walked over, still on the floor. His name was Paul Wellstone. State of Minnesota. Paul was in a tough contest. Paul was in a tough re-election campaign against Norm Coleman, a mayor up in the Twin Cities. And I went up to Paul, and I'll never forget as long as I live what he said. I said to him, Paul, that was a courageous vote for you with what you have to face back home. I said, I hope it doesn't cost you the election. Do you know what he said to me? It's all right if it does. This is who I am. This is what I believe in. This is why the people of Minnesota sent me to the United States Senate. That was what Paul Wellstone said. That was the last conversation I ever had with him. He died in a plane crash a few days later. But I'll never forget that. I'll never forget Paul Wellstone. I'll never forget Tom Allen and those who had the courage to stand up and vote no. And I'll never forget that young senatorial candidate Barack Obama back in the state of Illinois who stood up and said the same thing, that this war was wrong. That was a key moment, a critical moment that showed the kind of wisdom and judgment that we need in a president of the United States. In the history of the United States Senate, we have to live with things called filibusters. Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Jimmy Stewart stands at his desk, speaking until he literally collapses from physical exhaustion. Well, those were the old days. We don't do much collapsing anymore, but we still have filibusters. In the history of the Senate, the largest number of filibusters in any 2-year period of time was 57. 57 times a senator or a minority stopped the Senate from acting on a bill with a filibuster. Until this Congress, until this Republican minority. They have broken the record. We've now had 73 filibusters. Many of them have been filibusters against measures to bring this war to an end. We have tried repeatedly to have a timetable to start bringing our troops home to the hero's welcome that they deserve. We have tried to establish an end game so that our troops will come home and the Iraqis will stand and defend their own country. I will tell you this, until you send me a Democratic senator from Maine, we're not going to be able to stop these filibusters. And if we can't stop these filibusters, we can't help the president lead this nation. We can't bring an end to this war. We can't pass the legislation we need to help working families across America. That's what this election is all about. What Tom Allen's candidacy means is the right position on issues for the values that we share.